Okay, welcome back. This next shorter segment is going to deal with stress, which is a situation that sometimes accompanies emotional responses. So, you know, there are lots of situations that describe stress. You're in sort of some sort of conflict with your parents or a situation that you're in, and you have negative emotions that result from that. You're having challenges, locked in or something like that, when caring after someone, looking after someone, or you may be sick yourself or something. This again, this being overwhelmed by a situation can be a part of stress. Um, and you may be under some kind of, threat to your well-being, as we all are in some degree or the other. And this in turn may lead to negative emotions of some sort, perhaps fear, perhaps sadness. So it's a sort of complex set of cognitions and emotions. Sometimes the situation causes the emotions, sometimes the emotions will cause situation. And this interplay is what we call stress. So, um, how do we describe what useful things have psychologists learned about this? Well, the sort of seminal work here is by Selye, and he has a couple of very interesting insights. He suggests that what the general physiological, cognitive, emotional changes that we call stress, they are linked to an evolutionary response in which the body sort of goes through a general pattern of changes uh, which prepares ourselves to deal with threatening situations of various kinds. So the first phase of this is what he calls the alarm phase, in which there's a situation that you're in, and it raises your fear, and you physiologically respond to the fear and by a series of bodily changes. So we've already looked at that. So you will have the release of adrenaline, you will have blood sugar being released, heart rate going up, you'll have digestion being stopped, you'll have the immune system being shut down because the body is in shutting down all peripheral operations, non-essential operations, and preparing to fight for survival. So this was a much earlier observation that there's this particular pattern. This is called the fight or flight response. Um, and the idea here is that it's really designed evolutionarily for the kind of challenges we faced. So, a predator is chasing you, or you're chasing a prey. In both cases, your prepared body is preparing itself for extreme, immediate physical, short-term physical exertion. But unfortunately, um, we may find ourselves in unusual evolutionary situations. So, you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by a course that you're taking. Now, that's not something that's going to be decided by extreme physical exertion in the next 20, 30 minutes, right? It's something that prolongs itself over weeks and months. And that's not necessarily what this is designed for. So the initial alarm phase then then prolongs itself in this situation, continuous sort of problem, facing yourself in a long-term problem, and then you move into what is called the resistance phase. So the initial alarm phase response prolongs and becomes chronic. And now this is problematic in a number of ways. So the system is not designed to be long-term in this situation. And multiple things happen. One is that you become less able to deal with additional stressors. So you're already in stress, you're in a resistance phase now. Obviously, it's been prolonged, and you're not able to respond to small term, otherwise things that you would not notice, loud noise in your room. Suddenly you're yelling and shouting at people for that. Right? So you're not able to take additional loads at this point. Also, um, as the alarm phase is prolonged and becomes chronic in the resistance phase, you have problems developing. So um, initially, alarm phase digestion stops. Resistance phase, you get a permanent disturbance of digestion. You can't digest your food properly. Initial alarm phase, your blood pressure, heart rate goes up. Resistance phase, it's prolonged, it keeps on happening, and you may get into hypertension, permanent high blood pressure, or permanent hyperreactivity of some kind. So this is the resistance phase, and then it goes into the exhaustion phase, where the system just gives out. So you will, because your immune system is shut down, you give into a minor infection, or you get sick because you get prolonged hypertension or something of that nature. So you have the alarm, the resistance, and then the exhaustion phase. This was the original idea. Now this has been explored and expanded further. So Selye was of the opinion that, for example, of the total pattern of when the alarm phase becomes moves into the resistance phase, when it becomes chronic, your weakest system may collapse. So one person may become hypertensive, another person may have cardiovascular disease of some kind, heart disease of some kind. Another person may develop digestive problems of some kind or acidity of something. So whatever the weakest part of the system is, वो constant high activity level पे the weakest subsystem will give out. That was the idea. Now it's been explored. People have looked in more physiological detail at what's happening. So the initial response, the alarm response, of course, is your autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system gets aroused, and it causes your inner adrenal uh, gland, the medulla of your adrenal gland, the inner part of it, to release adrenaline, epinephrine or norepinephrine, सारी एक ही चीजों के नाम है, and that causes a series of these physiological changes. Then they've explored the impact on this of what is called the HPA, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal cortex uh, axis. So what happens is your hypothalamus activates the pituitary gland. That in turn activates the adrenal uh, cortex, the outer part of the adrenal cortex, to release inner part. Medulla is releasing epinephrine. The outer part reduces cortisol, produces cortisol, and this in turn causes release of blood sugar. It generally causes a lowering of inflammation or damage to various tissues in the body. But in prolonged use, it can in fact damage uh, these organs and make them sort of, it sort of stops their normal healing responses, uh, which in the short term is good, uh, but in the long term may actually cause damage. Right? So when you have in the resistance or the exhaustion phase, these are the normal short-term changes are now causing harmful problems. So one thing uh, that we can look at in terms of stress is that it doesn't occur in equal amounts to everybody. Right? So we are, for example, right now going through a very unusual phase in which there's a lot of stress for a lot of people. Um, but in fact, a lot of people, for example, who are blissfully unaware, are not stressed right now. Now that may be bad for them if they catch an infection, but they're not stressed in that sense of the word. They're being able to manage the arousal level that is being caused by their cognitions about the corona disease. That's right. In other examples of people who may be differentially impacted, it's known, for example, that very stress commonly impacts women more because a lot of the negative events of life, from harassment to child rearing duties and so on, are lopsidedly sort of imposed on one gender versus other. Another sort of category at high risk is, of course, are people of lower socioeconomic status. Right. So, what's my problem right now? Well, I'm stuck at home, but I have money in the bank. when I need food, it's still available. I can go and get it. In fact, I've got money, so I've got enough food for a month or half. For a daily wager, these are now becoming sort of overriding concerns. If you don't work, money comes in. If no money comes in, there's no stockpile of food. So uh, the significance of the impact is lopsidedly more intense for one group of people than for another. And this, in turn, it's been found, means that the kind of exhaustion phase and resistance phase problems that occur are also more are correlated more, found more in some groups of people than others. So if you look at what socioeconomic status is correlated by, it's correlated by, for example, far higher rates of hypertension, far higher rates of diabetes, far higher rates of heart disease. And the idea here is, why is this happening? It's because poor people are much more regularly giving stress physiological responses. Much more commonly are their stress responses going into resistance and exhaustion phase, and therefore their systems are generally more vulnerable. And if you look at it over a lifetime, you will find that their system, these subsystems collapsing, is much more an occurrence in lower socioeconomic status than in affluent people. Similarly, another set of people who are at risk are children, because their system is in developmental phase, and when it becomes activated again and again and again in the developmental phase, that causes changes in the structures and how they develop and play out. So children who have been hyper stressed or stressed for a long time tend to uh, be tend to have more reactivity. They tend to become hyper alert, hyper vigilant, have much greater difficulty getting into trusting relationships, and they tend to respond with greater negativity, are more likely to have negative emotions triggered by smaller events. So these, in the development, exposure to stress, repeated stress in the developmental stages of life, can have long lasting consequences that become chronic. System permanently changes its structure, and that in turn makes you more vulnerable to the downsides of a chronic stress response. There are significant individual differences in this. So, not all people are equally reactive. Some people are less reactive, they don't go into a full blown alarm phase as readily, and they are able to inhibit the alarm phase, go back to normal phase. So, their parasympathetic nervous system can override the sympathetic nervous system more effectively. And these people are therefore intrinsically better able to cope with stress than others. So there is that aspect of individual differences. Um, Another element of the stress response is, as I mentioned, the immediate physiological response includes a inhibition of the immune system. The idea here is the body says it's a non-essential system. In this immediate emergency, we can inhibit it, shut it down. It can be restarted later. But again, prolonging it gives rise to a less useful pattern of changes. And this area, which is called psychoneuroimmunology, PNI, looks at what happens when you have stress and sort of emotional responses and what that does to um, your system. So your immune system, of course, has lots of components. Your white cells, which gobble up any sort of foreign bodies that are circulating. You have killer T cells that do the actual killing. You have helper T cells. You have multiple kinds of cells. Helper T cells that modulate how the killer T cells are doing their job. These circulate through the body and through the brain, and they are regulated by it. And what happens with prolonged stress, when the brake is put on this system, for too long is that your body becomes more prone to infections, more likely to give in to infections. So if you look at the classic study, expose people to a simple cold virus, which is also a coronavirus, but obviously less problematic. They looked at those who were artificially stressed versus those they were not, and people who are artificially stressed have a much higher rate of developing an actual infection compared to those that do not. This is no secret to any faculty member. I know from years of experience that around midterm time and around finals time, a lot more people in class are coughing and sneezing because the stress of it means that they've um, got a problem which otherwise their immune systems would have had to fight off, would have been capable of fighting off. There are other kinds of uh, ideas that there's lots of evidence that prolonged stress, for example, may deregulate uh, the helper cell system, which means you're susceptible to autoimmune diseases, where the immune system attacks parts of your own body. A number of neurodegenerative diseases, in which neurons attack, the immune system attacks the neural systems in particular, are also linked to prolonged periods of stress, particularly stress during a developmental phase of life. The very behavior of cells is obviously you've got adrenaline, you've got cortisol that is changing how cells are doing their job, and that in turn can impact cells not directly related to your immune system. Every so right so one important part of the DNA of cells is telomeres. These are kind of the time clock of each cell in your body. So each of us, you and I, start off as a single, cell, and then the single cell keeps on dividing till a full body forms. And then while you live your life, lots of cells in your body, your skin cells, your liver cells, your blood cells, they're dying and regenerating. So it's one. It starts with one cells, and you can think about your entire life as like a billion or so um, sort of reproductive uh, states of that single one cell keeps on dividing. Every time that cell divides, it copies its DNA, and the telomere part of the DNA shortens. It's like the cell has got its own clock, and the telomeres get short, cells stop dividing and they just die. Right? So the timeline has run out. What you find is that prolonged stress shortens the telomeres a lot more. In effect, it's you're burning up your body faster in terms of the number of cell divisions that are happening. There's particularly stunning sort of versions of this when you look at identical twins who, remember, start off as one cell. If you have identical twins, one of whom has had a very stressful life and the other one has not, um, their telomeres for the stress one is much shorter. And I've seen images on this on the internet. One of them literally looks 10 years older than the other one, even though they're identical twins. And the idea here is that in terms of cell division time, because of telomere shortening, in, due to the impacts of stress and the physiological impact, the body has become older in effect. Right? So these are the kind of changes that stress will have in terms of your ability to physiological responses, including immune responses and so on. So what kind of psychological variables can we think about as impacting this? Well, um, we can think about cognition, which of course impacts emotions. We know maybe if we have a positive outlook, if you're an optimist versus a pessimist, does that make a difference? Initial sort of studies were very promising, and it turns out if people are optimistic and the health situation that they're in terms of immune responses, is minor, there is an impact. Um, but these initial studies were kind of, you know, their initial promise did not live out because when people instead studied more serious kinds of health conditions, for example, cancer or cardiovascular disease, and looked at if a person is optimist versus a pessimist, does it have an impact? It turned out there wasn't a great deal of impact on that. So it's likely that pessimism is really having its impact in terms of people being more energetic and coping with the situation better. So optimism works best if it is integrated with reality and with linked behavior. If you're optimistic and you use that to motivate yourself and do the things that you're supposed to be doing to look after your health, like uh, exercising more and eating more and so on and so forth, then it does have an impact. Um, if your optimism shows itself in कोई नहीं होता फिक्र ना करो इसमें क्या बात है, then it has a negative impact. It does not have an impact at all. And see, therefore, in serious illnesses, simple states of mind doesn't necessarily produce a um, better outcome. There are other kinds of psychological variables that uh, have been linked to health and immunology. One very classic study in the 60s talked about type A personalities. If you were a sort of an alpha personality, quick to anger, dominant, domineering, so on and so forth, it was found that these people had far higher rates of um, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on and so forth. So again, this was, you know, chill out, or you're going to shorten your life window was the idea. Don't be a top boss because you'll enjoy yourself for the first 40 years, but then get really sick really fast. Again, this personality idea on more unpacking did not work out very well. In fact, people find that lots of aspects of personality had no impact on rates of disease. There was just one subset, uh, which was the degree of hostility people felt. And now that did have a link, and there the causal pathway is relatively easier to understand. Hostility means rapid arousal of anger. And as a part of physiological arousal of expression of anger, you have in responses by the heart rate, by the blood sugar and release in the bloodstream, and so on and so forth. And the idea here is people who are rapid or repeatedly quick to trigger this response system will wear out this system. And those people with high hostility tend to be the one who do have actually or a very high correlation with cardiovascular disease and related uh, kinds of illnesses. So that's in terms of um, cognition and emotional release. There are other kinds of emotions that have been linked to um, well-being and coping with illness. So depression, for example, is known to have a negative impact on cardiovascular disease, on cancer, on a variety of kinds of illnesses. Above and so, you know, the causal chain here is complex. So, you've got cancer, obviously you're going to be depressed. So if there's a negative outcome, did the cancer cause both the depression and that? Uh, if you have a cardiovascular illness and you're depressed about it, what's the causal arrow? The evidence seems to be that there's a feedback loop. Yes, these cause the depression, but depression has a independent effect in addition to this kind of illness, and it primarily seems to produce its impact by lowering a person's motivation to to take charge of the behavioral changes or lifestyle changes that will actually produce a positive impact. तो आप डिप्रेस हो गए, आप हाथ पैर आपने मारना बंद कर दिया, and that's what's how depression is adding to the overall situation. At the heart of this interplay is a the concept of locus of control, which is a cognitive concept in terms of what do you fundamentally believe? Do you fundamentally believe that your actions will have an impact on the situation that you're in. Right? So, and locus of control, you can think about an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. And the classic work is here by the psychologist Rotter, um, who worked with dogs. So, what he would have is he would have dogs in an apparatus where they were given electric shocks through the paws, and dogs will either jump over a barrier to terminate the electric shock. The animals who could do this, who could jump over a barrier, learned to do this very rapidly and they suffered no ill effects. The animals who got the same amount of shock as the animals that could jump over the barrier, but which could not do anything themselves to control the shock. तो shock दोनों groups को एक ही मिले. एक group अगर jump करते हैं तो shock कम हो जाते हैं. तो fairly quickly they learn to jump over और shock मिलने बंद हो गए. उनको जब shock मिलने बंद हुए तो Rotter ने इस group को भी shock देने बंद कर दिए. Number of shocks delivered were equal. This group could alter the shocks with their behavior. This group could not. What he finds is that this group has no ill effects. The group that had damage that could not control the electric shocks that were delivered, they suffered the same amount of shocks, but they had much more ill effects. And this leads to the idea that our belief state about whether the bad things that happen to us are under our control or not, or the things generally that happen to us are under our control or not, the degree of control we exert actually has an impact on health. And this has been known, for example, in a lot of old people's homes. The more expensive ones will put a lot of effort in making the old people make their own bed, clean their own room. I mean, do the kind of things that you would think they would want done for them in an expensive facility. But in fact, they found that when elderly people keep on these things, keep on doing some useful job, keep on looking after themselves, they have much better prolonged chronic health situation than when people are not allowed to do these kinds of things. So, um, Rotter called these people having an internal locus of control versus an external locus of control. And I gave you an example of this earlier. I talked about, when a bad exam grade happens to you, do you believe it was your fault? There's nothing that you can do to change it, and so on. So, if do you have an external blame, external locus of control, but internal blame? In that case, it causes very negative emotional impact. If you have an internal locus of control, मैंने जी नहीं चाह रहा था पढ़ने को, अगर मैं करता तो मैं यही ले लेता. Right? That's an internal locus of control. That has a much more protective impact in terms of your emotions and also in terms of the secondary outcomes that occur as a result of these events. So you have uh, the idea of crisis situations also. What you find is that people who survive them best are people who decide on a plan and work on it. The people who suffer the most stress and the most negative emotional impact of these are people who feel helpless. To the degree that you feel helpless, that actually helps protect you psychologically and also in terms when you don't have stress, you'll have a better immune system response as well. तो आप मतलब हाथ अगर धो रहे हैं और you're disinfecting surfaces and you're wearing a mask and you're doing all these things, this shows a plan and it keeps the locus of control in you and keeps the degree of stress and the negative impacts of stress manageable. And this brings us, sort of in conclusion to this module, to, well, how do we gain control? Right? One way of gaining control is what is called primary control. You attempt to gain control of the situation itself. आपको एग्जाम स्ट्रेस कर रहे हैं, प्राइमरी कंट्रोल इज स्टडी द मटेरियल, मास्टर इट, you've got primary control. Right? So you've resolved the situation. You are in an unhappy situation with a sibling or with a friend or with a parent. You talk it out and you get some attempt to get some clarity or get the space that you need or sort it out. Right? That would be a primary control. In sometimes, of course, it's not possible. Right? So in one degree, in one sense, we are not in primary control of the situation that we find ourselves in. The government is determining it. The nature of the virus is determining it. There's a there's a limit to the kind of primary control that we can achieve. The other kind of control is called secondary control, in which we control or we change our expectations and desires that come of a situation, right? So, actually, mera aim nahi aata, right? But so you would say, well, you know, um, if for the career that I'm planning, this was not a central course that I needed to score in the end. हो जाएगा. So you're altering your understanding and sort of your appraisal of the event that has occurred. You can part of secondary coping would be changing the comparison group with which you compare yourself. Right? So you're in your house, you've got food to eat. You're one of the lucky people. Right? So that's the idea. Of course, we can think about religion in many ways in giving us control, either by religious belief and praying, giving us primary control that I convince God, all we do is necessary. It also gives us secondary control in the sense that कि ये चीजें खुदा के हाथ में होती हैं, हमें सब्र शुक्र करना चाहिए. That is a form, it would be a form of secondary control in these kinds of situations. So that is the chapter on emotion, stress, and health. And obviously, we'll be doing question and answers in the live sessions. Again, reminder, this is, I think, chapter 11 of the readings. And I'll be posting the kind of questions that I expect you to answer. Sorry, I'll be posting questions in the quiz. But in the meantime, you can think about the reading, the questions that are part of the text itself to practice whether you understand this lecture and the reading material together. All right. Good luck to all of you and keep your spirits up and your stress levels low. All right. Take care.